Tuesday night to join us for this event that I've been looking forward to for several weeks now. My name is Elizabeth Russ. I am the chair of the Department of World Languages and Literatures and a professor of Spanish and Latin American literature and culture. And it is my pleasure to be here tonight. Just a couple of quick logistical things. Number one, if you were here for a class and you didn't sign in, the sign-in sheets are on a table right when you come in. Make sure that you sign in before you leave tonight. Also, and I will mention this again, and we'll mention it again at the end, but we are having a reception afterwards, catered by Cinco Taco, I believe. So please stay for a few minutes, continue the conversation, and grab some food before you take off after the event tonight. So the Department of World Languages and Literatures is pleased to sponsor this event on language, violence, and activism, a conversation about Mexico today. And we do have several wonderful co-sponsors that I also wanted to mention, including the Peggy W. and Herbert L. DuPont Lecture in Hispanic Studies, the Clement Center for Southwestern Studies, and the Women and Gender Studies program. In addition to that, I wanted to highlight two co-sponsors. First of all, the SMU Mission Foods Texas Mexico Center, which has organized the delicious reception that will follow this event. And I wanted to give a special thank you to Jenny Apperty from the center, who's here tonight. And then secondly, the Wild Detectives Bookstore, which if you haven't been, you should go, in the Bishop Arts District. But the Wild Detectives Bookstore, and especially Javi Garcia del Moral, who's also here tonight. And without him and his energy, generosity, and inspiration, we wouldn't have the Dallas Hay Forum, which started last year and continued this year, and we hope to see come back many years to come in the future. So thank you. On a personal note, I also want to thank my colleague Lourdes Molina, who is the one who brought the Hay Forum to SMU last year and again this year, so thank you. So before we get started, I just want to introduce my two colleagues who are helping out with this event. Leticia McDoniel will be translating tonight for Yasnaya Aguilar. Born and raised in Mexico, Professor McDoniel received her PhD in Hispanic Languages and Literature from Washington University in St. Louis. And she has done a lot of research and writing about the Mexican-American border and border culture. And then Talia Weltman Cisneros will also be with us tonight. She'll be moderating the discussion. Professor Weltman earned her PhD from the Department of Romance Studies at Duke University, and she also has close ties to Mexico as she's done a lot of field work in Mexico, studying issues of Afro-Mexican identity. So with that, I will let Talia take it away and introduce our distinguished guests.
Thank you, Libby. Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes. In Ayuk, which is a Mixe language, E kumente ku mahaate, mahat. Let's try. E kumente ku maat. Excellent. Or good afternoon. Welcome everyone. We're really pleased that you all came today and to be a part of this fantastic discussion with some incredible guests that we have joining us this afternoon. Before we get started with our discussion and our presentations and introducing our two speakers, I wanted to just take a small moment to bring your attention to the image on the screen. Take a moment to take a pause from the craziness of our day and acknowledge that where we are right now is Wichita Land, which is part of a project from the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation and the U.S. Department of Arts and Cultures in acknowledging ancestral lands and ancestral regions. So where we are at this moment, having this discussion on issues of human rights, discrimination, violence, activism, social justice awareness, noticing where we are, paying respect to ancestral lands, is just a little gesture that we can make towards or a call to action, not only about awareness and action, but also to think about the many legacies in our place right here at SMU in Dallas, Texas, as we will think about the many legacies that our speakers will discuss in terms of space, place, languages, migration, displacement, settlement, violence, and activism, and what it means to not only respectfully acknowledge, but to give voice to a lot of voices who have been silenced. And that is one, perhaps, of a linking tie between the discussants this afternoon and what they will be sharing with us. So I respectfully acknowledge that we are on Wichita land. I want to take a minute to introduce our fantastic speakers today. Our first speaker is Yasnaya Elena Aguilar. She's a linguist, writer, translator, human rights activist, and Ayuk researcher from Mexico. She works with Ayuk Spanish and English languages and is a member of the Colegio Mije, a collective that researches and promotes the Mije culture. And that is mainly found in the Oaxaca region of Mexico. She's participated in national and international conferences and workshops, including the 14th legislature in the Chamber of Deputies, and within the framework of this year's, 2019's, United Nations Declaration as the International Year of Indigenous Languages, which she represents in terms of the discussion of the condition of Mexico's indigenous languages, to raise awareness about the consequences of what can happen when languages become endangered. Welcome, bienvenida, Yasnaya. And our second discussant, our second guest with us is Mr. John Gibler. He's an American journalist. Maybe he can speak to what American means in the Americas, right? And he predominantly writes from Mexico and about Mexico. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including Mexico Unconquered, Chronicles of Power and Revolt to Die in Mexico, Dispatches from Inside the Drug War, and I couldn't even imagine that they would kill us, an oral history of the attacks against students of Ayotzinapa. He's also a correspondent for Pacifico Radio's KPFA in Mexico, and he's reported from the ground from the Zapatistas' other campaign about protests against electoral fraud in Mexico City, the uprising in Oaxaca, and has also reported for Left Turn, These Times, Common Dreams, Yes Magazine, Color Lines, and Democracy Now! So we're very fortunate to welcome these two extraordinary guests who really put into action the role of bringing out voices, stories, oral histories, narratives, legacies that are often silenced, and help us think about how to make those a part and empower them in the narratives of their countries and beyond. So please join me in giving applause to our guests. And just a logistical note, we'll have each presenter share some words with us, and then take time for questions, discussions, and of course, tacos after, right? Yasnaya?
Вјескохује, Анџи Цупецнајао комец Јавет комен пат улц шпакмулаа, Вјескохује Надемија Адер Шпактак, Шпактак, Хавиер, Јон Намук Панетја en Mamacham Naktoya Oyen Tukmuk Gafshmaya, Nadena Kama in the Dark and Doran that Nashmiyat, Kibats, Tsukmuk Amuk Tukmuk. Buenas tardes. Muchísimas gracias a todas las personas que hacen posible que estos encuentros, que podamos tener estos encuentros. Muchas gracias a la universidad, a Javier, a John, a todas las personas involucradas. Yo estoy muy contenta de poder tener este diálogo.
Good afternoon, and many thanks to everybody, the university, to John, to Javier, and I'm very happy to be here and be able to produce this dialogue.
Voy a hablar sobre, en un principio como lingüista, tenía una pregunta y era ¿por qué las lenguas del mundo estaban muriendo y por qué mi lengua tenía una situación de discriminación y otras lenguas del mundo no? ¿Qué es lo que hacía distinto la situación de cada una de estas lenguas?
I'm going to talk as a linguist, and I had a question, and the question was why are languages dying, and what constitutes the death of a language, especially indigenous languages.
Or what my language is dying and what Spanish is not dying. What's the reason behind this phenomenon? Entonces, eso me llevó a preguntarme que algunas lenguas que eran consideradas indígenas tenían un estatus distinto a lenguas no indígenas.
So this made me ask myself why some languages had different status than the indigenous languages.
Entonces, la pregunta me llevó a decir qué significa ser indígena.
So this question led me to ask, what does it mean to be indigenous? Ask myself that question.
Y en México al menos también se utilizaba la palabra, se utiliza todavía la palabra indio, como que había dos, ¿no? Indian and indigenous. Yo quería saber de dónde venía, por qué era yo, eso.
And in Mexico, it used to be, or they still use, the difference between being Indio, Indian, and being indigenous. So she wants to explore what's the difference between those two different references. And why are they applied to her?
Entonces, como me gustan mucho las palabras, me fui a la historia de esas palabras para tratar de averiguar qué estaba pasando.
So since I like words a lot, I went to the history of those words and see what was happening.
Y me preguntaba, hacía estas preguntas, ¿no? What does indigenous mean? What does Indian mean? What does native mean? What categories does it oppose?
So she asked herself those questions to see what does it mean, and so bear with me, never done such a biggest translation, but so that's what she was asking herself.
Porque me parece muy importante saber si yo soy indígena y yo tengo ese rasgo, cómo se llaman los que no son indígenas y por qué no lo son.
So it was very important for me to know if I am indigenous and I am who they say they are, then what are the other ones and what are their characteristics between one and another.
Y me parece muy importante en los procesos de definir cualquier categoría, saber a qué se oponen, cuál es su contrario o sus complementos.
And it is very important to know the processes of these definitions and see what are their contraries or their counterparts and why are they different.
Y tenía también otras dos preguntas, too many questions. Is it an identity category, indigenous, as an identity category, or is it a cultural category?
So I have two more questions, or many questions, and one of them was if it was an identity category, or was it more a cultural category?
Si era una categoría identitaria, tenía un problema, y es que yo me enteré o estuve totalmente consciente de que era indígena hasta que llegué a la Ciudad de México.
So if it was an identity situation, then I had a problem because she wasn't conscious till she got to Mexico City that she found out that she was part of that indigenous identity.
Que me llamaban.
Or they call her
they call
identity.
me indigenous woman.
So that's when you discovered that that's what, they were calling her indigenous, and the existence of that category.
Eso significaba una cosa, que no era una categoría identitaria, porque una gran parte de mi vida había vivido sin experimentar como parte de mi identidad ser indígena.
So if it was not an identitary category, then it was a problem because she had not experimented it during her upbringing as an indigenous person in an indigenous community. It was not till she left that she realized that this was the category that was referred to. Right?
Y también mi abuela es una mujer que solo habla mije.
And my grandmother is just a woman that only speaks Mije.
Y yo le pregunté si ella se sentía indígena.
And I asked her if she felt indigenous.
Y me dijo, yo soy mije, no indígena.
And she responded, I'm Mije, not indígena, nor indigenous.
Eso también quiere decir que su experiencia identitaria no pasaba por la categoría indígena.
So that meant that her experience or identity experience did not pass through the indigenous category.
Entonces me fui a la siguiente pregunta. Is it a cultural category?
So then she went to the following question, which is it a cultural category?
Entonces, esto significaría que todos los pueblos indígenas del mundo compartimos un rasgo cultural.
So this would mean that all the countries, we all share something cultural, right?
All the indigenous peoples would then share a specific feature, cultural feature.
Y yo me pregunté cuál es ese cultural feature that we share as indigenous people in the world. Y me fui a buscar el origen de las palabras.
And so I went to look for the origin of these words.
Este es un río, pueden ver,
This is a river you can see.
y es un río que corre en Pakistán y en la India.
It's a river that runs through Pakistan and India.
Su nombre está en una lengua antigua que es el sánscrito.
Its name is in an ancient language, which is Sanskrit.
Y este río se llama Sindhu.
The river's name is Sindhu.
Sindhu. Y Sindhu se pasó al latín como indio y al español como indio.
Sindhu was taken into Latin as Indio and in Spanish as Indio.
Es el río, ahora se conoce el río Indo.
Now
It's called
the river is called el Río Indo, or the River Indo.
Y este río le dio nombre a toda el área por donde pasa, que es la India.
And this gave name to the whole region, which is India, which is where the river passes through.
Y yo me preguntaba cómo es que el nombre sánscrito de un río terminó siendo una palabra con la que me insultan en Oaxaca.
So I asked myself, how is it that a Sanskrit name of a river in the region of India and Pakistan turns into a word that's used to insult me in Oaxaca?
Esa es la historia que quiero contarles.
And that's the story I want to share with you all.
Normalmente se piensa que indigenous and Indian están relacionados etimológicamente, pero no es verdad.
It's usually thought that the word indigenous and the word Indian are etymologically related, but that's not the truth.
Normalmente se piensa que indigenous es la versión políticamente correcta de indio.
It's usually thought that the word indigenous is the politically correct way of saying the word Indian.
Pero no es verdad.
That's not the case.
Indio, como dijimos, es el nombre en sánscrito de un río que después, ya no les voy a contar la historia que todos sabemos, que Colón se confundió y que dio nombre por esa equivocación a los pueblos que encontró en este continente.
So we now know that Indio comes from the name of this river And I'm not later, but I'm not going to tell you the story now that everyone's heard that Columbus was confused and misnamed a region of the world that he thought he had arrived at. It wasn't the case.
Indígena, por otra parte, viene del latín y viene de indi, que es de ahí, y genus es nacido, nacido ahí.
And indigenous comes from Latin, and it comes from the root indi, which means from there, and genus, which is born.
Ambas palabras, indígena, que es nacido ahí, que bajo su sentido etimológico, todas las personas del mundo seríamos indígenas.
So if you think about the word indigenous, which its original meaning is born over there, or born there, etymologically that would make absolutely everyone indigenous.
Yo podría llegar aquí a Dallas y decirle indígenas etimológicamente a todas las personas nacidas aquí.
So I could arrive here in Dallas and etymologically correctly call indigenous all the people born here in Dallas.
Pero ya no es ese significado etimológico. El nombre de un río y el nombre de una palabra que significaba nacido ahí, ahora se utiliza para nombrar a personas como yo.
But that etymological sense is no longer in use, it no longer carries power. So that original name of a river, etymologically meaning born there, is not the sense in which the word is employed to name people like me.
Entonces, planteaba otra pregunta. ¿Por qué dos palabras de orígenes tan distintos se estaban utilizando para nombrar a los pueblos indígenas del mundo?
So then that's when I realized why, and I asked the second question, why, or the other question, are two words that are so etymologically different in the sense are used to refer to two different things or same things in one place.
Y para complicarlo más, había otra palabra que era originario en español o native en inglés.
And to make things even more complicated, there was another word that's added that was native, that's mostly used in English, and it's the word native, so that even complicated it a little bit more.
Y también tenía preguntas sobre eso, porque había comunidades con mixtecas, por ejemplo, de Oaxaca, que habían migrado casi por completo a Los Ángeles. Entonces, ¿ellos seguían siendo native people o ya no?
So I also had more questions about this, especially with the Mixtecas, because a lot of the people from there had migrated to Los Angeles and they were called natives, so that's got a lot of confusion as well.
Nativo o originario, en ciertos contextos también en el mundo se estaba utilizando contra la población migrante. Era como si la gente de aquí tuviera más derechos que alguien que llegue.
So the word native or originary, where you're originally from, was also being used kind of derogative, especially for the people who were coming from another countries.
So the word native or original was used against migrants, so that, as a way of distinguishing that people supposedly from a place had more rights than people arriving to a place.
Y con un rápido vistazo a la historia de la humanidad, podemos decir que todas las personas han sido migrantes y que al final todas las personas somos originarias del Valle del Rift en África.
So we could say that everybody has been a migrant and everybody has come from the river of Africa,
Rift Valley en África.
from the Rift Valley now.
Entonces tenía todavía más preguntas
So then I had even more questions.
y traté de buscar qué es lo que tenían en común pueblos muy distintos entre sí.
So then I tried to search to see what populations that were very different had in common.
Y también busqué si la diferencia entre indígena y no indígena existía en las lenguas indígenas de México al menos.
And I also searched see if there was any difference between indigenous and non-indigenous within the indigenous communities or languages.
Ajá. Y me di cuenta que casi en todas las lenguas indígenas de México no existía la categoría indígena.
And I found out that in most of the indigenous languages in Mexico, there was no category for indigenous,
con dos excepciones,
with two exceptions,
maya y náhuatl,
Maya and Nahuatl.
lenguas que sufrieron especialmente los efectos del colonialismo.
Languages or tongues that really felt, and especially the effects of the colonialism.
Y las palabras que pueden traducirse como indígena o como no indígena eran estas dos.
And the words could be translated as indigenous or non-indigenous are the following two.
Macehual for indigenous and Caxtlan for mestizo or non-indigenous. Macehual es la palabra que se utilizaba para, antes de la llegada de los españoles, para las personas que no eran de la nobleza.
So Macehual was first used before the arrival of the Spaniards to denominate the people who belonged to the nobility.
Y Caxtlan viene de Castilla, castellano, el nombre del español.
And Caxtlan comes from Castilla, from Castellano, from the name of the Spaniards.
Y solo estas dos lenguas tienen esa diferencia.
And only these two tongues or languages have the difference.
Para nosotros, como pueblo mije, la diferencia que importa es los que somos mijes Ayuk y los no mijes se llaman Agats. You are Agats. ¿Lo sabían?
So for us, Mijes, there's only one difference. Those who are who we are Mije, Ayu, or those who are not, which are the
Agats.
Agats.
Y Agats puede ser un zapoteco, un wichita, un cherokee o ustedes. Comparten ese rasgo, no son mijes, son Agats.
And los Agats can be Zapotec, a Cherokee, or Wichita as well, or anybody that's here in the audience like you.
Ustedes son Agats, es un hecho, ustedes son no mijes, pero esto no formaba parte de su identidad. Tan es así que se acaban de enterar.
So you are Agats, and you are, because you're not Mijes, and now you just found out that you are part of this Agats.
Which shows you that it had not previously formed part of your identity.
Entonces es una distinción aparte. A los mijes nos interesa quienes somos mijes y todos los demás que no lo son pueden ser indígenas o no. Y entonces ustedes compartirían para nosotros un rasgo con los wichitas, los cherokee, que es ser no mijes.
So for us, Mijes, what interests us is those who are Mijes, and the rest of everybody else is that they're not Mijes. So you can definitely share commonalities with other, the Cherokees or any other community that's not Mije.
Entonces en las lenguas indígenas, en la mayoría, en casi todas las lenguas indígenas de México, ni siquiera existe la palabra o la categoría indígena.
So in most of the indigenous languages in Mexico, at least, there's not even that category for indigenous.
Entonces todavía era más interesante de dónde viene, por qué soy indígena.
So then it was even more interesting to find out what is that Mije, or
What is the root of that word? Why am I called indigenous?
Entonces fui a ver, quiero presentar 3 casos muy contrastantes que en el mundo son pueblos o naciones que se consideran indígenas. Y mi pregunta es, ¿por qué son indígenas?
So there are 3 cases I want to present that are very contrasting, that they are considered either small towns, pueblos, indigenous, and they're in pueblos.
Looking at 3 different cases where people are called indigenous, and our question is, why are these people called indigenous? 3 different cases across the world.
Why are they indigenous? Some people are from Norway and Russia and Finland. ¿Por qué ellos son indígenas? Ellos son el pueblo Sami y su territorio quedó en 4 países, dividido en 4 países: Noruega, Suecia, Finlandia y Rusia.
So, why are they indigenous if they are one town or one population that are Norwegian, Sweden, and
The Sami peoples, and they're in several different countries. Why are they considered indigenous? They're present in Finland, in Russia, in Norway, and in Sweden.
Son indígenas europeos.
They're European indigenous peoples.
¿Qué es lo que mi pueblo tenía en común con los Sami?
What does my peoples have in common with the Sami?
En esta foto están haciendo una manifestación en contra del gobierno de Noruega para pedir que se respeten sus derechos como pueblo indígena.
In this photo, they're protesting against the Norwegian government, demanding that the Norwegian government recognize their rights and respect their rights as the Sami peoples.
Y el caso Sami era algo que en México contrastaba mucho porque la categoría indígena había sido racializada y el color de piel de ellos no cabía en el prejuicio de lo que es ser indígena en México. Pero tanto el pueblo Mije como el pueblo Sami son indígenas.
So the Sami case contrasts drastically with the case in Mexico, where indigenous as a category had been racialized. And here you will see that the people described as indigenous have the same skin color as the people calling them indigenous, which was not the case in Mexico.
Este es el pueblo Mije, esta es una foto de la región Mije. Nos gusta mucho jugar básquetbol. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que compartíamos el pueblo Mije con el pueblo Sami? ¿Por qué somos indígenas?
So this here is a photograph of the Mije peoples in the Mije region. The Mijes are great fans of basketball. So the question is, what do the Mije people share with the Sami peoples that are both described as indigenous?
En el caso del pueblo Sami, nunca llegó un señor llamado Cristóbal Colón.
So in the case of the Sami peoples, a Mr. named Christopher Columbus never arrived in their territories.
Y todavía más, el pueblo Ainu en Japón.
and then now more the Ainu peoples in Japan.
En Japón hay pueblos indígenas, uno de ellos es el pueblo Ainu, que aquí está en una manifestación, en una marcha, para pedirle al gobierno japonés que reconozca, ahí dice, we want indigenous rights. Y mi pregunta era, ¿qué compartimos el pueblo Sami en Europa, el pueblo Mije, el pueblo Cherokee y el pueblo Ainu, que somos todos indígenas? Yo no sabía.
So there are many indigenous communities in Japan, and this gave me to ask myself and recognize what do we have in common, the Mije, the Cherokee, the Animo, and it's that we are all indigenous. And
All being called indigenous. And here in the photograph, they're in a protest that says, we demand the government recognize our rights as indigenous peoples.
Entonces, indígenas, si estos tres pueblos somos considerados indígenas, indígena no podía ser una categoría identitaria, no formaba parte de mi identidad, tampoco una categoría racial por las diferencias, o racializada por las diferencias tan grandes entre Samis, Mijes, Cherokees, Wichitas y Ainus.
So if all of these different peoples are being described as indigenous, what could they share in common? What could that category mean? The category couldn't be an identity category because I didn't share any identity features with the Sami peoples in Norway or the Ainu peoples in Japan. It also couldn't be a racial category because, as you can see, the Sami, the Ainu, and the Mije peoples, for example, are not sharing those characteristics.
Y tampoco una categoría cultural. Culturalmente no tenemos casi nada en común.
And it's also not a cultural category because culturally we basically have nothing in common.
Y pensé, bueno, tal vez tiene que ver con ser originario, pero en el caso del pueblo Ainu, la isla que es Japón, la pobló primero los japoneses hace muchos miles de años y después los Ainu. En todo caso, los japoneses serían los native.
And I also thought maybe it could be pertaining to the idea of originating in a place. The indigenous category is related to a place of origin, but that's not the case here with the Ainu peoples. Actually, the Japanese people had arrived to the islands that are now the territories of the Ainu before the Ainu. So in any case, in those territories, it would be the Japanese people who would be indigenous and not the Ainu.
Entonces encontré que lo único que teníamos todos los pueblos indígenas del mundo era que éramos pueblos o naciones que no habíamos formado países o estados.
So then I found out that all that we had in common was that we had not formed a nation or as
Not from the state.
a state,
There were peoples and nations that did not form
or
a
a
state.
state.
Nos parece natural ahora que el mundo esté dividido en países, ¿cierto? La ONU dice que son aproximadamente 200 países. Entonces tenemos un mundo dividido en 200 cajas con fronteras, visas, pasaportes. Pero eso es muy nuevo en la historia de la humanidad. No es normal que solo existan 200 estados. Todos los pueblos que no formamos un estado somos considerados pueblos indígenas.
So it seems natural to think now that about different ways of borders and stuff and visas and all that. According to the ONU, there's 200 countries with borders, visas, and passports and all that. And but that's now, but before it wasn't normal.
Also, that it seems natural that the world is divided into states, and the states have borders and passports and visas and all of these requirements, and these states are basically arbitrary boxes. Now it seems very natural to us to assume that they exist, but they're very, very new creations. And something that the indigenous people share is that these are peoples who don't have a state. They never formed, peoples in different places in the world, but they had never formed a nation state.
Entonces me quedó claro que indígena era una categoría política, no cultural, no identitaria, sino sobre todo una categoría política que se oponía al Estado. En el momento en que la región Mije, mi región, decidiera formar un pequeño país, dejaría de ser indígena y seguiría siendo Mije.
So then it came clear to me that that we had not formed a state or a nation, so that the indigenous was not a state, so it was the opposition for the state, and it became a political situation and power to denominate certain regions, and so it wasn't cultural, it wasn't identitary, so it became part of that political situation.
Indigenous is a political category. It's not a cultural category, it's not an identitary category, it's a political category. If the Mije peoples were to create and declare their own Mije state, they would stop being indigenous, but they would still be Mije.
A los estados, a los gobiernos, les gusta mantenernos a los pueblos indígenas como si indígena fuera folclore, tradición, cultura, rituales. Eso lo somos, como todo el resto del mundo tiene rituales y tradiciones, pero prefiere leernos como una categoría cultural y no política para restar agencia.
So the states and governments like to see us as folkloric, as peoples with traditions, with a lot of culture, with rituals. And yeah, of course we have traditions and culture and rituals like absolutely everyone has, but the state likes to speak of us and see us only in these terms in order to strip us of agency.
Si pensamos que el pueblo Mije tiene 7000 años de historia basados en el momento en el que se domesticó el maíz,
If we think about the Mije peoples as a peoples with 7,000 years of history that start with the moment in which corn is domesticated,
de esos 7000 años, solo 500 hemos sido indios y 200 indígenas.
of those 7,000 years, we've only been Indians for 500 years and indigenous for 200 years.
Es nada en nuestra historia y podemos cambiarlo.
It's absolutely nothing in our history and we can change it.
También me di cuenta que había otros pueblos sin Estado en el mundo que no eran considerados indígenas. Por ejemplo, el caso de Escocia.
I also realized that there were other peoples in the world without a state, but they were not considered indigenous peoples, as the case with Scotland.
También el caso de Cataluña,
Also with the case of Caramun.
que son naciones con su propia lengua e historia, pero que no son considerados indígenas y tampoco han formado un Estado.
They are nations with their own language and their own story, or history, but they haven't formed their own states and they're not considered indigenous.
Entonces dije cuál es la diferencia, y es que sobre la categoría indígena pesa el colonialismo y la racialización. Ser considerados también como indígena, como una raza, aunque sabemos que biológicamente las razas no existen.
So I asked myself, what is the difference? And you can see here that in the creation of this category, both racialization and racism and colonization have been imposed, even though we know that biologically the category of race doesn't exist.
Por lo que quisiera proponer una definición de pueblo o nación indígena como pueblos o naciones que no formaron estados y que han sufrido colonización y racialización.
So I would like to define indigenous peoples, indigenous nations, as peoples who did not form states and also suffered racialization and colonialism.
En el caso de México, aquí podemos ver un esquema. Antes del colonialismo no había categoría indígena ni nada, había el pueblo o la nación náhuatl, la nación mije, la nación zapoteca, muchas naciones.
So if you look in the case of Mexico, before colonization, there was no category of indigenous. There were the Nahuatl peoples, the Mije peoples, the Zapotec peoples.
Y después, con el establecimiento del periodo colonial de los españoles, todos estos pueblos se categorizaron como indios.
And then after the Spanish colonization, all of these different peoples were categorized as Indians.
Y los indios se oponían la otra categoría eran criollos, que eran españoles nacidos en este continente.
And then they also opposed the criollos, which were the ones born in this continent, Spanish born.
Mulatos, que eran hijos de afrodescendientes y europeos.
Mulattos were the sons of the Afro-descendants and Europeans.
Mestizo, que significaba algo muy concreto, que era hijos de españoles e indígenas.
And mestizo, which was something very concrete, which was sons of Spaniards and indigenous.
Y se creó en la colonia un sistema de castas con estos nombres, son mucho más.
And there are many other names, but it was the system of caste was created, and there are many more, but this is
Los españoles nunca utilizaron la palabra indígena,
the Spaniards never used the word indigenous,
solo indio.
only Indian or Indian.
Indígena se empezó a utilizar hasta el siglo XIX, como a mitad del siglo XIX.
And the word indigenous did not get to be used until late the 19th century.
Para los españoles fuimos indios y para el Estado mexicano indígenas.
For the Spaniards, we were indios, and for the Mexican government and state, we were the indigenous.
Y ahorita las dos.
And now both.
Cuando se creó el Estado mexicano, todo este sistema de castas solo colapsó en dos opciones.
When the Mexican state got formed, the system of caste collapsed into
Categories.
categories:
Indígena o mestizo.
indigenous or mestizo.
Se borró la población afrodescendiente.
So all the population that was descended from the African descendant was erased,
Que era muy numerosa, pero se borró de la historia.
and it was very numerous, but it was erased from history.
Y el ideal del Estado mexicano es que todos los indígenas nos convirtiéramos en algo que era la identidad mexicana, que era ser mestizo.
And the ideal for the Mexican state was that all the indigenous people were converted to mestizos, which was the ideal
Entonces, esta es la definición de indigenous people are a stateless nation that have suffered colonialism. It's a political category, and we can stop being indigenous while still being Mije, Zapotec, Cherokee. Y la gente se asusta, me dice, ¿tú quieres dejar de ser indígena? Y le dije, sí, pero no dejar de ser Mije.
So people get scared and say, so you want to stop being indigenous? Like, yes, I want to stop being indigenous, but not me.
Porque significaría que hemos creado un mundo en el que ya no existen estados que combaten nuestra existencia.
Because it would mean that we've created a world that will be battling our own existence.
It would mean that we've created a world where there no longer exist states that are battling against our very existence.
Ahora lo voy a relacionar con las lenguas. Este mapa muestra la distribución de las lenguas del mundo en la actualidad.
So this map shows the distribution of languages across the world in the contemporary period.
Los puntos rojos, donde hay más puntos rojos, hay más diversidad de lenguas.
Where the red points is where there's the greatest diversity of languages.
Son aproximadamente 6.000 lenguas en el mundo las que se hablan actualmente.
It's approximately 6,000 languages are currently spoken across the world.
Y hay una relación, no sé si causal, entre diversidad lingüística y diversidad biológica, de tal manera que los lugares con mayor diversidad de lenguas son los lugares con mayor diversidad biológica.
And there's a relation, we don't know if it's causal or not, but a relation between linguistic diversity and biological diversity, such that we see in the regions where there's the greatest amount of linguistic diversity, there's also the greatest amount of biodiversity.
Este es el caso de México. En toda Europa hay lenguas que son solo de 3 familias lingüísticas. En México son lenguas de 12 familias lingüísticas.
So in Mexico, this is the case. If you look across Europe, all of the languages spoken in Europe are from 3 different linguistic families. But in Mexico, there are languages spoken, Mexico just one country, from 12 different linguistic families.
En Oaxaca, que es del tamaño de Portugal, se hablan lenguas pertenecientes a 6 familias lingüísticas.
So in the state of Oaxaca, which is about the size of Portugal, languages from 6 distinct linguistic families are spoken.
Más de 150 lenguas distintas en Oaxaca.
There are more than 150 distinct languages in Oaxaca.
Porque palabras como zapoteco son agrupaciones de lenguas muy distintas.
Because words like Zapoteco are actually groupings of a whole number of languages that are distinct.
Sin embargo, la situación de pérdida es muy, en este momento de la historia, es terrible. According to the Catalog of Endangered Languages of the University of Hawaii, 1 language dies every 3 months on average. And according to UNESCO, 50% of languages will have no speakers in 100 years. It's very difficult situation. And why is happening? Why is this happening? Because of the mass extinction of world's languages is related to the rise of the nation states. If we consider that each state only use 1 language, only 200 languages are supporting by state. Por lo tanto, hay como 5.800 lenguas que no están utilizadas por el Estado y que son combatidas por el Estado mismo.
So there are 5,800 languages that are not identified with the state, and these languages actually suffer direct antagonism and combat from states.
Porque los estados tienen una idea homogénea y monolingüe, como por ejemplo aquí en Estados Unidos que hay un movimiento que se llama English Only Movement, que trata de que cada país es una sola lengua.
Because the states have this idea of having a homogeneous country, and they kind of want to do that. For example, here in the United States, you have the English-only movement, and that's part of this homogenization that everybody should speak the same thing and be monolingual.
En Francia no solo se habla francés, sino más de 10 lenguas de ahí. Y,
Not only French, but more than 10 languages are spoken.
y cuando estas lenguas pidieron ser reconocidas, el Estado francés se negó.
And when they asked the French government to be recognized as languages, the French government denied that right.
And they said that the language of the Republic is only French. En México también pasó esto. Estas dos personas, después de la revolución, José Vasconcelos, un filósofo, Rafael Ramírez, un pedagogo, hicieron todo un programa para matar nuestras lenguas, para que dejáramos de hablarlas.
And the same thing happened in Mexico during the era of the revolution with José Vasconcelos in education and Rafael Ramírez as well. And they tried to, through education, only teach basically Spanish.
Y le decían esto a los maestros que iban a vernos. But if you, to give them our science and our knowledge, you speak to children in their indigenous language, we will lose faith in you because we would have to incorporate you too into our culture again. You will start by using the language of children, then without realizing you will take the customs of the ethnic social group to which they belong. Then the lower forms of life, and finally you yourself will become an Indian, that is, one more person to incorporate. This I tell you is not a joke, but a serious thing. The whole life of the people is condensed into a language, so that when you learn a new language, you also acquire new ways of thinking and even new ways of living. This is why I consider it's very important that you know how to teach Spanish as God commands. That is, without translating into the child's language. You must be very careful so that your children not only learn Spanish, but also acquire our customs and ways of life that undoubtedly are superior to theirs. Y este es todo lo que hay atrás del esfuerzo, y para eso nos golpearon, nos castigaron, nos mandaron a lavar baños y toda una serie de violencias para erradicar nuestras lenguas.
And this is what is behind this, and that's why we were punished, we were segregated in a way, they put us to clean bathrooms and do other things such as that in order for us to speak just one language and speak one language. And eradicate the indigenous or Indian languages.
Por eso decíamos que las lenguas no están muriendo, las están matando los estados.
So this is why we say that the languages are not dying, but the states are killing them.
Y aquí están los números. México se creó en 1821. En 1820 es el porcentaje de personas que hablaban una lengua indígena en México. La mayoría hablaba una lengua indígena.
So as you can see, the percentages in 1820, 65% of the Mexican population spoke an indigenous language.
Y ahora en 2010 somos 6.5%.
Now, 2010, it's only 6.5%.
El Estado fue más efectivo que los españoles.
So the state was even more effective than the Spaniards.
Y bueno, estos son los hablantes de las lenguas que están a punto de morir en México.
And these are pictures of the speakers of the languages that are about to die in Mexico.
Sus comunidades sufrieron castigos muy fuertes, tenían que pagar multas y ellos ya son los últimos
Their communities
hablantes.
suffered a lot of violence. They have to pay fines if they spoke their language, and these are the last of the survivors, the speakers of this.
Entonces, solo quiero terminar, que ya por tiempo, en definir qué entonces es una lengua indígena. Entonces, languages spoken by peoples or nations that did not form nation states and suffered colonialism. Languages that are not used or endorsed by federal government, and indigenous languages are languages without an army and without a navy. Thank you.
Festival, which has been an amazing encounter and gathering of people and conversations. I'd also like to offer heartfelt thanks to the student who went to buy us each a cup of coffee. And it's an honor to be here with Yasnaya. I think she's absolutely brilliant. And I'm going to try and speak very briefly to the issue of the dangers Mexican reporters face in the contemporary moment. In the last 10 years, Mexico became one of the most dangerous countries, alternately between countries at war like Afghanistan, the single most dangerous country in the world for reporters. In the last 15 years, more than 100 Mexican reporters have been murdered, and those murders remain in pretty much absolute impunity. The overall impunity rate for homicides in Mexico is officially 95% impunity. That means 95% of murders not only not solved, but are actually never investigated. And the same remains true with reporters. Who are the reporters who most suffer the risks and the violence? These are Mexican men and women, journalists, usually living outside of the nation's capital, people who are not living in Mexico City. They're living in states like Veracruz, Oaxaca, Sinaloa, Chihuahua, Guerrero, Mexico State. And they're typically working for smaller media outlets, newspapers, print, but also radio stations and television stations, and often increasingly online news magazines. There are people who are typically working for sub-minimum wage salaries. One reporter who was murdered in the state of Veracruz a few years ago, Gregorio Jimenez, was paid 60 Mexican pesos for each story he filed. 60 Mexican pesos at that time was about $5 US. So $5 US per text. He would typically try to file anywhere between 8 and 10 stories a day. I don't know if anybody's studying journalism here, but or even people who are just taking your classes, imagine trying to write about 8 papers a day. Mostly the reporters who have been targeted with violence have been investigating one thing. Now, I would guess that most people would imagine the most dangerous thing to write about in Mexico is the drug trade, right? So who's moving drugs, who are the drug traffickers, what are the routes, where are they growing things? That turns out not to be the case. First off, because the state absolutely knows exactly where everything is grown. Could you imagine hiding Florida's orange crop or hiding California's almond crop? Mexico is the hemisphere's largest producer of poppies for the heroin trade. The heroin trade, of course, exploded throughout the 2000s and it very recently crashed after the opioid crisis and the fentanyl invasion here in the US. It actually turns out that reporting directly on the drug trade itself rarely happens, mostly because that's not a reporter's interest. A reporter's not trying to find out where something is sold that's an illegal commodity. That's what the police, in theory at least, are trying to do. The reporters are trying to look at what is the institutional responsibility, what is the state's role, and concretely over the last 12 or so years, what is the point of contact between the state and so-called organized crime? Or to be more explicit, in the last 12 or so years, what is this fusion? Where are the places and the ways in which the state and the organized crime organizations have fused? And there's a very explicit, though complex, reason for this, and that's really the drug war. It might sound odd, but this is a technology invented and experimented in the United States, first dating back to the late 1960s, then exported across the region, and only recently in 2006 developed in Mexico. First, a couple of just factoids. You think, okay, there's a government that decides drugs are bad, right? Because they're dangerous, because people take drugs and they get sick, or they overdose and they die, or because they take drugs and they do bad things, right? That's kind of the official state government discourse of why drugs need to be illegal and combated. And yet if you look at the history of prohibition movements in the United States, and then concretely in the last 50 or 60 years, the history of the so-called wars on drugs, every time the government injects fuel, so to speak, injects cash and media initiatives, public relations, and discourse into warring on drugs, the drug markets themselves expand. They expand wildly. The amount of production of drugs shoots up, and the amount of consumption of drugs shoots up. So something would seem to be amiss, right? It wouldn't make sense that the world's most powerful police state, the world's most powerful military, would constantly wage wars on something and fail so consistently. That's why I think when you look to try and analyze what's going on, what's being produced by the drug war, you have to step back from the idea that police are actually trying to combat drugs, or the DEA, right, the Drug Enforcement Administration in the United States is actually trying to stop drug trafficking. What seems to be taking place is that they're trying to administer it and they're trying to control it. And in the case of the United States, I think it's absolutely urgent to recall that the drug war was politically explicitly designed by the Nixon administration as a race war, as a racist war. This isn't conspiracy thinking, or how do you justify this. I recommend a book by a man named Dan Baum called Smoke and Mirrors, which does a good job of reporting the early years of the political construction of the drug war in the United States. He cites one of Nixon's advisors, a man named Handelman, who wrote in his memoirs the following quote, "Nixon knew that the problem really was the blacks. So you had to design something to address that problem without making it look like that's what it's doing," end quote. So in a context of black liberation struggles in this country, which the government was constantly trying to battle with targeted assassinations, with beating people in the streets, with misinformation, with twisting around new laws and trying to make it look like they were changing when they weren't, they invent the technology of the war on drugs. The first thing they do, however, is close the border with Mexico. A little known factoid. In order to wage a war inside this country, a race war, a white supremacy war inside this country, the first thing the Nixon administration did was close the border with Mexico. Why is that? Mainly to create the perception. Sorry, I'm really awful about microphones. I think I just broke this one. But I did. Great. I'm just totally incompetent. Sorry about that. I'm trying to keep respectful boundaries. So the technology is to create the perception of chaos, the perception of an enemy coming from outside the US borders, constantly creating the idea of danger, of badness, right? Now we've got this individual in the White House and all of his just overt and ridiculous discourse, but it dates way, way, way beyond that, of course. So with the technology of the drug war, dragging Mexico into it, and then over decades using this war to hide counterinsurgency practices across the region, particularly in Central America. Jump forward to the year 2006, and there were highly contested elections. Officially, the opposition candidate lost by only half a percentage point, but there were widespread allegations of electoral fraud. There was a massive protest movement in Mexico City that closed down the major avenues of the nation's capital for months. But finally, a president from the right-wing National Action Party, which had only been in power for 6 years after 71 years of prior political power and party monopoly, took office as the weakest president in Mexican political history. Why the weakest? Very briefly, because for so many decades there was a one-party state. So the one party that was always in power was constantly producing its candidates and producing elections without any kind of real effort to masquerade their monopoly on power. But that was finally broken in 2000, and an alternative party, which turned out to be a little bit more conservative, was able to take power. They were in office just for 6 years. And the first administration after that, which was Felipe Calderón, took office in a context of mass protests all over the country, unarmed uprising like the Teachers' Rebellion in Oaxaca that turned into a popular rebellion for several months until it was repressed by the federal riot police forces. So this president takes office as the weakest president in Mexican history, and apparently was desperate to create some perception of legitimacy. And he appeared in public within his first weeks in office in his home state of Michoacan in military uniform, declaring a war on drugs. And one of the first things they did was send the army into the streets across the country, heavily concentrated in his home state of Michoacan. So, bear with me, I apologize, this is chaotic and non-linear. The war on drugs was never real. They never actually sought to find out where drugs are produced and stop that production, much less have any kind of a public health or public safety perspective of harm reduction and public education. No, they militarized the country and selectively chose a handful of organized crime groups that were linked to their political opponents. In this case, Calderon's home state of Michoacan was governed locally. The state government was his opposing party, the PRD. So it's no accident that as he's trying to produce his own legitimacy, sending the army into the streets, he sends soldiers into a state governed by the opposition party, which turns out to be his home state. And so he constantly, just like here in the US, has to produce images of war to make people believe that a war is being fought, because the actual war they're claiming to fight is not being fought. So they have to send the army into the streets. They have to get into gun violence. They need to kill people. They need to arrest people and show these images to the media to say there exists a war. There was one man I interviewed in Ciudad Juarez in the month of October 2010, which was the most murderous month in the history of the city, which became in the context of the drug war, the homicide capital of the world. And the editor of the local paper, two of whose reporters have been murdered, told me the drug war doesn't exist. There exists a media war. For the government, things don't happen unless they happen on the front page. The only thing they're concerned about is producing the image of the war. In this case, journalists living and reporting and taking their kids to school in small towns across the country with access to very real information, rigorous investigations, who publish information that show these points of contact become the journalists facing the gravest risks and the gravest dangers. Very briefly, one instance, and there was just published in both Spanish and English, a 3-part long investigative series about the murder of the woman reporter Miroslava Bric in the state of Chihuahua on March 23rd, 2017. This 3-part series was published anonymously and collectively in media across the country and internationally because the reporters could not publish their own names, the information that they gathered. It was too dangerous. Miroslava Bric was murdered in her car at 6:50 in the morning as she was taking it out of her garage to take her son to school. Her son was just coming out of the house and saw his mom get murdered and run back in. Miroslava had published articles for years detailing the connections of local political power structures, mayor's offices, police chiefs, finance officials in the local government, and the drug trafficking trade and the drug production trade. Concretely, she published in March of 2006 an article showing all of the connections of candidates for mayor across the Chihuahuan Sierra to the different drug trafficking organizations, and she published their first and last names and all of their connections. On February 20th, 2017, she published another article in the national or Mexico City-based newspaper La Jornada with the names, first and last names of police chiefs, local police chiefs who were known to operate for the different organized crime organizations. So these, again, are these points of contact, these points that show the fusion, the melding, the fact that even a concept which appears to be a protest concept like corruption is no longer serviceable. It no longer helps us understand the nature of the transformations that are taking place in the state and in political violence. I tried to do that really quickly and it probably made no sense. I'm sorry.
So we will take the rest of our time to answer questions, to expand the discussion. If you have a question or a comment, ask you to please stand and speak loudly. Unfortunately, we don't have microphones to go out into the audience. We'll repeat the question as needed so that everyone can hear. But this is an opportunity to think about the different issues that both of our wonderful speakers have brought to the table today. Violence expressed in different ways: linguistic violence, political violence, ethnic violence, racialization, and physical violence as well, and what it means in their respective communities, locally and globally, across our borders, and how it resonates with our communities and things we hear in our social media feeds, and our news feeds, and in our communities at this time. So, any questions, comments? Puntos extras. If you can stand up, speak as loud as you can, we'll repeat as needed.
I remember reading during the Mexican election cycle where AMLO was ultimately elected that he had talked a lot about stopping the fight to the war on drugs, no longer fighting. But I have up on news of his administration since then. How do you feel that relates to the power structure Mexican elites and the drug traffickers in Mexico today?
Did everyone hear enough, or should we repeat?
So first off, Andrés Manuel López Obrador is the current Mexican president, and he's basically been campaigning for president since 2004. He ran in 2006, and it seems that the election was stolen from him. He ran again in 2012, and it seems like he lost the election. He ran again in 2018 and won the election, right? So I like to take a long view of what he said and done over that whole period, and then more concretely in the last 9 months that he's been in office, right? He took office in December 2018. So first off, a little known factoid. In the period of the WikiLeaks scandals, which everybody probably remembers, one of the embassies that was involved and whose cables were released was the US Embassy in Mexico. And in the just incredible reams of cables that had been published, there was a cable from an embassy official in the US Embassy in Mexico City talking about a meeting that they had with then presidential candidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And in the meeting, the embassy official spoke very highly of López Obrador, said this is someone we can work with, and as an example or proof of that, quoted López Obrador as saying that he would be committed on fighting the drug war, and in fact, when he was elected, he was going to send the army into the streets to fight the drug war, which is exactly what Calderon did, which is exactly what led to now 13 years of almost indescribable constant atrocity. So then you've got his campaign period. During the entire campaign period leading up to 2012, when the country was trying to figure out, wait, what is happening? Things are significantly changing in the country. And initially it was just kind of minimized, depoliticized as, oh, it's gang violence, it's drug violence, right? Just very similar things happen in this country, right? And so it wasn't taken seriously in a lot of the media, and it wasn't taken seriously by the administrations until the acts of atrocity were so outrageous it became impossible to not talk about it. It became what everybody in Mexico was talking about, people in their homes, people in their communities, but also artists were talking about it, athletes were talking about it, right? Musicians were talking about it. The one person who wasn't talking about it was López Obrador. It's very interesting if you look back through his campaign speeches, he was all about primero los pobres, primero los pobres, primero los pobres, which means first the poor, right? First the poor. So he was talking about an economic kind of political strategy that seemed completely out of sync or out of joint with what the country was experiencing in terms of violence and political violence disguised as drug violence. I remember watching the debates in 2012 and setting a challenge to myself, because one of the key points of pain and inquiry, it seemed to me, in Mexican society was people talking about impunity, impunidad. The fact that so many horrid things were happening, there was no institutional response to institutionally pursue justice, right? So this idea of impunity, impunidad. And this was a word I was hearing everywhere, except in the presidential debates, right? Which struck me as a very telling fact. In the subsequent campaign cycle, López Obrador kept talking about primero los pobres, or first the poor, but he shifted to talking a lot about corruption. and it became one of his main campaigns. He said, I'm going to fight corruption. I'm going to fight the corruption. We have enough money in the state structure and the tax base to really address poverty issues. This was kind of his speech. But we never can get our hands on that money because it's always stolen by the very people who administer it. So his complete campaign strategy was all about corruption, which he would say, hey, that sounds great, yes, we should do that, but there was a notable absence, again, that there was no talk about violence. When people would ask him about the drug war, he would say, oh, I'm not going to do that, and you'll see that things get better. And when there's economic opportunity, people are going to stop fighting for drug cartels, right? And then in those course of years, there were several events that became kind of like national wounds or national tragedies, in the sense, not only because it's something particular to do with that event, but I think because the event revealed things that were happening all over the country that people are experiencing in their homes, in their hometowns. So one of these kind of core traumatic national events was the forced disappearance of 43 college students by uniformed police officers on the streets of Iguala Guerrero on September 26, 27, 2014. Again, notorious silence. Lopez Obrador did not speak about that event. As a national political figure, he didn't hold a press conference the first days after those attacks to say, this is outrageous. This is never going to happen again. In fact, what happened was that there were a number of photographs of Lopez Obrador posing and hugging and smiling different people that seemed to be in some way politically involved in the attacks against the students. That should be, and even then he was just like, oh, I don't know everybody I take a photo with at a campaign event. But there was no serious engagement. What, for me, as a person born and raised in the US, but living in Mexico since the 2000s, and living through these experiences, what for me was personally painful and unforgivable is that I saw no real engagement in him with the pain. It seemed like he was never genuinely disturbed. There are a lot of things politically I would critique Barack Obama about, one of which he became the president who deported more migrants than any other president in this history of this country. He expanded drone assassination programs all over the world, but there are key moments when something like nationally wounding happened in this country, and he came out and he spoke with what seemed to me, I'm just watching a political figure on a screen, but like pain, right? At least there was that. And with this guy, not to mention who's in the office of this country right now, which doesn't feel anything, except greed maybe, I don't know. But with AMLO, that's what I couldn't forgive him. So in the key moments when he's president-elect, of all sorts of horrid tragedies, 72 migrants slain in a barn in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, 49 human torsos thrown on a highway in Calaveita, 20, I forget how many people, murdered by uniformed military soldiers in Tlatlaya, the state of Mexico, 43 students forcibly disappeared by police officers in Guerrero, feminicide, which used to be a word associated to one city, the ritual killing, the political ritual killing of women, to Ciudad Juarez. And in the context of the so-called drug war, it's expanded across the country, and there are multiple cities that have now gone beyond Ciudad Juarez as the cities with the largest number of femicides. So none of these, just any one of them, should have been world-destroying and a major political discussion, but none of them until, as president-elect, almost exactly a year ago, Lopez Obrador appeared on the stage next to the families of the 43 disappeared students from Ayotzinapa and made an explicit commitment. He said, I will find your sons. So the 43 students were all boys and men. I will find your sons. I will find the truth of what happened, and I will do justice. Explicit commitment. Now it's been 9-10 months that he's been in office, and there is not a single arrest. There is not a single presented either to the families or to the nation, to the media, major break in the case, even though the case is probably one of the most exhaustively documented and rigorously investigated in recent Mexican history. And in the meantime, Lopez Obrador was just talking about, he at one point talked about an amnesty. as if we've been, experiencing some kind of a civil war or insurgency. And when Lopez Obrador wanted to talk about an amnesty for people involved, either members of the armed forces or police forces, or of so-called organized crime cells, the families of people who've been disappeared. It's a hard thing to get your head around maybe in this country, but forced disappearance, which is when you abduct someone and take them to an unknown location, and then either you hold them, you torture them, you force them into labor, sex, forced prostitution, or often cases it's forced agricultural or construction work in regions controlled by different organized crime police conjunctions, or oftentimes murder the people and dispose of their remains. So that whole gamut of possibilities included in forced disappearance, which is why you can never assume that someone who's been forcibly disappeared has been murdered, and the families can never assume that, because they're desperately looking to try and find their children alive. But forced disappearance has become a kind of newish tool, where it was previously a form of state terror in combating perceived opponents of the state. It becomes a neoliberal capitalist tool in the expanding drug war and drug markets, such that, for example, the Central American migrants crossing Mexico into the United States become some of the most vulnerable people in the hemisphere, systematically abducted off the highways with military and state police roadblocks, taken off buses, robbed of everything they have, their family members called, threatened that they'll kill their family member if they don't Western Union a certain amount of money, $14,000 to a certain account. Exorbitant. It's like pressing out, squeezing out monetary content, dollars from people's lives, and then murdering them and incinerating their bodies or burying their bodies with bulldozers in barren fields in the states of Tamaulipas, Monterrey, and then throughout the route. There are more than 40,000 people forcibly disappeared in Mexico, according to federal statistics, in the context of the last 10 years, 12 years in so-called drug war. That does not include the tens of thousands of Central American migrants abducted, kidnapped, or forcibly disappeared on their route through Mexico. And Lopez Obrador hasn't talked about any of this, hasn't done anything about this. The homicide rates continue to expand, forced disappearances continue to expand and to take place. And even in the one case that he made an explicit promise, there still hasn't been a single concrete action. It's intense. At the same time that there's this intensely hard, bleak, disturbing reality of violence and political oppression and repression in Mexico, there's another side, right? Which is the incredible strength, the ferocity of love, literally. In this case, concretely, families, and almost always at the forefront of the families, mothers. Mothers who become experts in forensic anthropology. Mothers who become experts in locating mass graves, hidden graves. Mothers who become detectives, who travel across the country, who interview people in prison, people who have possibly been involved in very, very violent acts, to try and find information to find their children. Right? Especially, it's one example where, for me, the case of family members of the disappeared, and in the last 10 years, how simultaneously that forced disappearances have expanded and skyrocketed. Also, the people's response, the people's most directly affected, and then around them, yes, smaller networks of solidarity of other people who join with them and create organizations and do everything from travel around the country to speak about the issues of forced disappearance, or to travel around the country to find people alive by interviewing different people, by becoming legal scholars and getting access to case files, to try and find people in different so-called criminal organizations that might be able, since they're already incarcerated, to give some kind of information, or families literally looking for their kids underground. That really started in 2014 after the forced disappearance of the 43 students when the state officials in Guerrero dug up a mass grave with 29 human remains in it, and none of those remains were identified as belonging to one of the 43 students. When local residents saw that, that's when they said, that's unfortunately where my child might be. And so since the state and the government wouldn't do anything to help them, just denied or gave them forms to fill out, or said, no, you have to wait a certain number of months before we can consider your family member disappeared, the families just started organizing themselves, traveling, even though it's incredibly dangerous, throughout rural regions, looking for mass graves, and what's more horrible, finding them every Sunday that they went out. But that's a concrete example of, for me, where I find power, where I find hope, where I find some kind of inspiration and encouragement, is just precisely outside of the state structures, how people come together, not only to fight, and it's not only to demand, for example, the state does something, even though that might be a necessary step, but every time that you demand the state does something, you're also kind of giving power to the state and acknowledging the state's power over you. And every time you don't even pay it, or you're aware of the state, but you don't ask them for anything, and you do things and you build things, then you're doubly constructing power, because you're constructing the power of trying to get what you need. If it's finding your child, or if it's creating harm reduction infrastructure without like the whole needle exchange programs, and you're also doubly creating the power of consolidating, organizing, and community structures. So for me, in Mexico as well as in this country, it's not politicians, it's not different kinds of laws, and it's not new institutions that I think will help us move away from horrid forms of violence, but precisely the opposite. People's movements, people's coming together, people organizing. And even though you might have to have a kind of tense relationship with the state, either to survive or to play a political game, you're constantly aware that that's not where it's at, and that's not what you're really trying to do. What you're really trying to do is elsewhere, and it's to the side, and it's amongst people. And this is also kind of, for me, a very important and beautiful point of contact with everything that Yasnaya was describing to us, which is like how to create an imaginary of thinking towards a world where we don't need these 200 boxes, right? Where we don't need these states as the way that they've been built for only a few hundred years as explicitly colonial, capitalist, patriarchal political formations.
We will take a pause to the formal discussion sessions and questions now, and I invite you all to join us to continue the conversation, to continue chatting with Yasnaya and John. There's a lot to discuss, there's a lot to engage with as we eat, but I want to please ask you to join me in thanking Yasnaya and John. Thank them for speaking other truths. Thank them for making other voices visible in many different pathways and in many different spaces, voices that have been silenced or disappeared or cast aside and marginalized, and for creating spaces for further dialogue where we're not boxed in or bordered or walled, but can really come together to have a different kind of collective from below that's pushing against the state or pushing against others that try to dominate, and re-articulating who we are, what we're about, and what our concerns are as we try to create a better world with love at the forefront, right? So thank you to Yasnaya and John, and please continue the conversation. Tacos, tacos, you must tacos.
Taco,